Marx's contribution to philosophy is one of the most important achievements of the 19th century. And what's important about it is the fact that he's attempting to do what may well be impossible. To synthesize, in this case, not the tradition of Athens and Jerusalem, Marx's project is to synthesize and unify the disparate elements in a number of different philosophical trends, but his most important consideration is synthesizing the English tradition of skeptical empirical political economy that comes from Hume and Adam Smith, and unifying that with the Hegelian tradition of idealistic interpretations of human history as a progressive series of developments. And he connects those two elements up with a third element, French utopian socialism, the kind that gets developed by Comte and other early 19th century writers who were interested in fundamental changes in the structure of society. Marx read and was conversant with all of these trends, and he wanted to synthesize in a way that wasn't unacceptably eclectic the disparate elements which, at least in part, appear to be so disparate that they resist synthesis. In the first place, Marx makes borrowings from English political economy. When I lectured on Adam Smith, it was very clear that there were some elements in his interpretation of the Industrial Revolution and the division of labor and the effect of the machine age on human society that I described as proto-Marxian. Let's think of a few of these proto-Marxian elements in Smith, the parts of Smith that Marx incorporates into his own views. The first is the labor theory of value. Smith, of course, borrowed the labor theory of value from Locke, but the labor theory of value, the idea that the value of a commodity is directly related to the amount of work that goes into acquiring that commodity, is a fundamental borrowing that Marx makes from the English tradition of political economy. You find the labor theory of value in both Smith and in Locke. And Marx thinks that it's a good idea, it's a sensible way of interpreting the nature of value, because it is essentially naturalistic in its orientation. What Marx likes about the English political tradition is it is very this-worldly. It tries to avoid metaphysical formulations. It tries to steer clear of mysticism. It tries to eliminate mythology from their interpretation of both science and society. Marx likes that hard-headed, essentially realistic, skeptical element that you find in Adam Smith. In addition to that, Marx borrows from Adam Smith the idea that the division of labor divides society into antagonistic social classes. I talked at some length in the lecture on Smith about the consequences of the division of labor. One of them being, or perhaps the most important of the consequences of the division of labor, is the fact that society fractures along lines of economic status. The fractures between those who own the means of production, what Adam Smith calls the masters or the employers, and the wage laborers, the people who are employed by these masters. They have different interests in society, and Smith recognized that fact, saw that the potential for social tension was there. Marx incorporates that idea into his theory of historical development. He thinks it's one of the great contributions that Smith made, in addition to the fact that Smith developed the theory of the division of labor and its significance for society. So there's a clear borrowing from English political economy, and not just from Adam Smith. One of the things that Marx borrows from the English intellectual tradition is the naturalism, the naturalistic orientation that we find in someone like Hume. Hume doesn't like metaphysics, doesn't like to drift off into airy abstractions, which is so characteristic of, for example, of some parts of the French and almost all of the German Enlightenment. Marx says this world, a naturalistic approach to ontology, is the basic orientation he wants to take. So all of that gets borrowed from Adam Smith and from the English political and intellectual tradition as a whole. He borrows from French utopian socialists the idea that a radical change in society is both possible and necessary. That society is developed to the point where it is practically possible to institute fundamental social change based upon a prearranged plan for reorganizing society. Most of the utopian experiments in socialism in the early part of the 19th century were dreadful failures. Marx believes that these were failures not because the idea itself is absurd, the idea of a fundamental and immediate restructuring of society. Marx thinks that they failed because they lacked what Marx can offer them, a scientific theory of history. Professor Staloff, in the last lecture, made clear the scientific elements in Marx's theory of history. Marx believes that when this scientific conception of human development is added to the mystical or utopian elements in French socialism, that you have established the potentiality for radical and immediate social change. The third element in Marx's philosophy, the third important borrowing, is the tradition of Hegelian historical investigation, or the Hegelian treatment of history. Many people who were writing at the time that Marx was were ardent critics of Hegel, and there are many good reasons to criticize Hegel. Marx himself was one of the leading critics of Hegel, but he was also willing to state that many of the critics of Hegel did not completely appreciate or understand his conception of history, and Marx said, let me say it now in public, in print, I am a follower of that mighty thinker. So Marx thinks very highly of Hegel, but he thinks that Hegel has made some profound mistakes in his conceptualization of human history and of human social development. Hegel takes history to be the progressive realization of the idea, the Geist, the spirit of human freedom and rationality. In that respect, Hegel is a metaphysician, and Hegel makes demands on our credulity that in the mid-19th century Marx is not willing to accept. So what he wants to keep from Hegel is the idea that history represents a progressive development, that it has a telos. Telos is Greek for purpose. What that means is that it has an end, it has a point to which it is going, to which it is developing, and Marx thinks, like Hegel, that he can discern that point. Again, this is one of the characteristic difficulties of all philosophers that want to be philosophers of history. It always leads up to them. So Marx believes that he knows what the end of human history is, and the end of human history in this case turns out to be the end of alienation and the end of social injustice based upon the organization of society with regard to production and consumption. In other words, Marx thinks that the Industrial Revolution has created the technological, practical capacity for the elimination of the problem of scarcity, and that means that the real problem in establishing just, rational, free, in, again, the German idealist conception of freedom, free social relations, is the problem of distribution, is the problem of paying back to labor that which labor produces. Now let's take some extrapolations from these borrowings. Instead of making his main theme the thinkers in a given society, as Hegel does, Marx chooses an alternative set of people as the universal class, as the most important set of people in every society. Instead of focusing on the thinkers the way Hegel did, Marx is going to focus on the doers, the people who actually make the things that allow people to survive and exist, the ones that create the satisfaction of human needs. And this is the working class. For Marx, the working class is that segment of society that comes into being at the division of labor, who produce all the things that the people in the society need, but who get back only a fraction of what they produce. This is the idea of surplus value. This is an extrapolation from the labor theory of value that we found in the English tradition. The idea of surplus value is basically this: that all the things, well, it actually comes from, it's a way of stating what King Lear says to the fool, that nothing comes from nothing. What Marx is saying is that all the good things in human life come from work. None of them appear there magically on their own. You have to go get them. If you want a hamburger, you must make it. If you want something else, you must go get that. It involves activity, work on the part of human beings in order to satisfy their natural biological desires. so nothing comes from nothing. And what that means is that all the good things in life come from work, which is a fairly commonsensical idea, actually. The problem is this. In the earliest stages of human development, at I guess the hunting-gathering stage of human development, there is no division of labor. Everybody's just cruising around looking for roots and berries and whatever it is that hunter-gatherers live on. At some point in time, there's a break from that hunting-gathering tradition, and sedentary agricultural life develops. And one of the key elements in the development of human society and the development of human productive forces is the division of labor, which comes in very early in history. And what this means is that there is a hierarchical set of producers and exploiters in all human societies from the earliest and most primitive division of labor on into the middle of the 19th century when Marx himself is writing. In other words, the division of labor is nothing new, as Adam Smith more or less suggests in his book. In fact, the division of labor is a very early thing, but because of the fact that it's not backed up by machines and technology, and of course since the market is so small, the division of labor can't continue on very far. What that means is that although the division of labor is very old, in terms of the increase in productivity that it creates, at least in its earliest phases, it's negligible. The really important part about the division of labor is the fact that it creates hierarchical social structures. Some people do the stuff that needs to be done in order to put food on the table and clothes on your back, and some people stand around and watch them. The group of people that do the exploiting, and what we mean by exploitation is taking from the socially produced goods and services that a society generates, taking what you need and giving back to the actual producers only a fraction. What the exploiters are doing in that activity is extracting what Marx called surplus value. The idea is something like this, because surplus value is really central to Marxism. The product of human labor is the total amount of goods and services that a society can generate. But the laborers in a society, after hierarchical social structures are created, after the initial division of labor, the laborers in a society, regardless of whether they're slaves or serfs or wage laborers, in every case, they produce everything that people live on. They produce all the goods and services because nothing comes from nothing. And at the same time, social relations are established, hierarchical social relations, in fact, that prevent the laborers from getting back everything that they produce. In other words, they produce 100% of the stuff that we have, and they get back something less than 100%. The spread, or the gap, between what labor gets back of its product and the total amount that they produce is called surplus value. The ruling class of every epoch skims off the cream of society's productivity and keeps it for itself, without actually contributing anything to that productivity. They sit around and watch the slaves work. So the idea then is that hierarchical social relations, relations in this case of oppression, are built into every human society that has the division of labor, which is to say that oppression is a concomitant of the division of labor insofar as it allows the extraction of surplus value. What Marx wants to know, his primary concern then, is what is the fate of industrial society now that we are in the machine age, in the age which creates a new and unprecedentedly productive set of social relations. What sort of political or social hierarchy will be generated from that? And in addition to that, how should we think about this? Is it possible to improve the human condition so that we can eliminate the exploitation of one set of human beings by another? And what Marx wants to do, what he sees as the end of history, is the end of the exploitation of one human being by another. He thinks that human beings should pull together in a sort of common effort to exploit exclusively nature to satisfy their desires. And what Marx means by oppression, or the technical term is hegemony, domination, what he means by oppression is the extraction of surplus value by a ruling group that doesn't actually produce anything. He believes that in every epoch, the class that rules the society is in fact a parasitic group of people who live off the real doers. And they exploit these people in order to satisfy their own desires, and not only that, In every case, the ruling ideas of an epoch, here we hear echoes of Hegel and the idea of the Geist. In every age, the ruling ideas of each dominant class are, in fact, those ideas which reinforce the social relations which allow this kind of exploitation to continue. So it should come as no surprise, for example, in the ancient world, when the dominant social relation of exploitation is the relationship between master and slave, that someone like Aristotle believes that there are some people are natural masters and some people are natural slaves. His entire political theory is or not the entire political theory, but a large chunk of his political theory is organized around legitimizing hierarchical social relations. And remarkably enough, he comes from a society that's dominated by hierarchical social relations, and remarkably enough, he benefits from these hierarchical social relations. So in other words, Marx thinks that there's an element of heteronomy. There's an element of passion which distorts people's thinking in favor of legitimizing social relations that benefit them. And that the entire history of human consciousness has been a gradual movement from one conception of a right political order and a right morality to another conception of political order and morality, and that these changes are not arbitrary or not chaotic, and they do not come from some metaphysical Geist. They come from a change in the mode of production. What he means by a mode of production is the characteristic way of producing things, and as a concomitant of that, there is a characteristic way of extracting surplus value. In the ancient world, the mode of production was called slavery, and the societies were divided into the free and the enslaved, masters and slaves. And amazingly enough, in the political theory of the ancients, slavery is taken to be basic and a fine institution. It turns out that that's in the interest of those who created the intellectual activity of the ancient world. And what Marx is saying is that that's a distortion, that that is ideology in the pejorative sense of the term, that these people are alienated. What we mean by alienation is necessarily false consciousness in defense of class interests, in defense of the interests of the people that have a parasitic relationship to the real workers. In the ancient world, Aristotle tells us that slavery is natural and we should anticipate it in any well-regulated social order. When we come to the Middle Ages, if we look at someone like Thomas Aquinas, we'll find that there's a divine sanction, a divine support for the monarchs of the Middle Ages. God creates some, not for all of them, but for at least the righteous monarchs, there is in fact divine sanction. There are some monarchs that breaks God's law. We can make exceptions for that. But generally speaking, political order is legitimized in the Middle Ages by referring to the will of God and by saying that aristocrats are aristocrats because God wants them to be. Why else would he have made them aristocrats? The king is the king because, well, the king rules by God's dispensation. The serfs, in fact, almost everybody else, are serfs because that's the way God organized the world. Aquinas, in other words, in his political theory, is legitimizing the particular exploitive social relations characteristic of the society he just happens to be living in. Marx says that this is no accident, that the ruling elite in every society is never going to support and encourage and make possible the extension and elaboration of political theories and moral theories, social theories, that undermine the organization of society which benefits them. What that means is we have a sort of feedback loop here between the economy and culture. There's a connection of heteronomy, of self-interest, not again on the basis of individuals, although that sometimes is the case, but we go back to the German idea of the collective subject. For Marx, the collective subject are social classes. The bourgeoisie has an interest. The slaves have an interest. The serfs have an interest. They form a sort of collective subject. So the history of economic development, the movement from slave labor to serfdom, the movement from serfdom to wage labor, carries with it changes in the productive forces of society, and as a necessary concomitant of that, changes in the structure of society, and as a necessary concomitant of that, changes in the way in which societies are legitimized. In the age of slavery, political theory established slavery. In the Middle Ages, we established serfdom. In the age of Adam Smith, in the age of English political economy, What did, at least in Marx's view, what did the English political economists do? They legitimized the society they happened to be born into because they were intellectuals. They were the hired guns of the exploiters. That's what the whole history of Western, or not just Western, of global cultural development amounts to. In every society, there's a group of exploiters and a group of producers that are the vast majority of the people. Among the group of exploiters, there's a group of people that don't actually do manual labor, that don't do the kind of labor that actually makes the world go. They do intellectual labor, and their function in society is to shore up and legitimize the particular kinds of evil social relations characteristic of a society divided into exploiters and producers. Marx thinks that the time has come to eliminate this. The time has come for the heteronomy which exploitive economic relations introduce into our political theory and into our theory of history, the distortions created by alienation, by necessarily false thought in defense of class interests. The time has come to abolish that. And as you may have guessed by the connection to the Hegelian system, when we finally abolish alienation, we will finally abolish classes. When we finally abolish classes, we will have finally abolished exploitive social relations. When we finally abolish exploitive social relations, there will no longer be false consciousness in defense of class interests, and we could finally see what we really are. History, as we have known it prior to this, will be over. We can begin the truly human epoch in human life when there is no longer false consciousness in defense of class interests. Alienation will be gone because the whole human family will understand that they are part of the same species, that they have one interest, the human interest, and that the alleged interest of one segment of society as opposed to that of another is in fact an illusion created by the education that we got growing up in a society divided into hierarchical producers and exploiters who necessarily have false consciousness in defense of an evil society. In other words, we are going to have the secular apocalypse. This is the end of the world. It's not that people will cease to exist, it's just that all of human history will have turned a fundamental corner. All right, this goes on quite a bit in the remainder of the 19th century and all partially the 20th century. Now, alienation can be combated only by adopting the position, the intellectual position of the exploited. In other words, you have to look at human history from a critical perspective which points out the heteronomous, here's a Kantian element, self-interested parts of the ideologies that have been generated in order to shore up these exploitive social relations. This critical analysis of society, this ruthless critique of everything existing, is called Marxism. And Marx believes he is the first man to penetrate the veil of Maya, the veil of illusion, and say what human history really is. Human history is a combination of our greed, of our unenlightened self-interest, and our credulous willingness to believe whatever fantasies are generated by a particular social structure, by our unwillingness to take things to their logical, ruthless conclusion. So autonomy and heteronomy, fundamental conceptions for Marx, not in the Kantian sense of a kind of metaphysical freedom which we derive simply by virtue of being free rational agents. He wants a this-worldly rationality. He wants heteronomy in this world which allows us to see that all human beings have a common interest. The elimination of exploitation, which is the same thing as the elimination of injustice. When we finally eliminate exploitation, there'll be no longer any hierarchies. Everyone will be equal in the sense that everyone will be required to work, and all the exploitation that we do will be the exploitation of nature through the technical advances that we get from modern natural science. Few social theorists have been as involved and as impressed by the development of modern natural science as Marx. So Marx is, in fact, an unlikely combination of disparate intellectual traditions. This idea of alienation, this necessarily false consciousness in defense of class interests, is probably his greatest contribution to philosophy because it gives us the possibility of an overall critique in a somewhat more rigorous and tough-minded way than Hegel offered us when we looked at the history of Western philosophy. Marx says, look beneath the surface. This isn't God's plan working out its way in history. This is just the human condition and human nature operating under certain contingent circumstances. The plan of human history is in fact the recreation of what we were before the initial division of labor. Remember that for Marx, hierarchical social relations, and as a concomitant to that, ideology and false consciousness, all that, is a product of the division of labor. But prior to the division of labor, we have what might be described as primitive communism. No conception of private property, no conception of personal ownership, no conception of legitimate exploitation of one person by another. So Marx says, in other words, this division of labor thing, it's just a phase. Right? We entered into it at a very early phase in our career as a species, and the ultimate finality, the final act of this drama, will be going back to that earlier primitive communism in which exploitation of one person by another is no longer allowed, but it will be with the addition of an enormous amount of productive capacity. It will be with the elimination of scarcity through technological means. And that means fundamentally our condition will be changed. We will have returned in some respects to the earlier Garden of Eden, to the pristine moral condition of true humanity, when we don't make a distinction between upper and lower classes. We will go back to what we really are by nature. So what Marx is doing then is not forcing us up to a sort of reconciliation with heaven. Quite the contrary. And here comes the naturalistic orientation of the English political and philosophical tradition. He wants to get us ultimately back to nature. Not nature as it's red in tooth and fang, but nature as human societies are before the introduction of evil social relations, before the introduction of exploitation. There is a yearning for a lost innocence here. And it's not hard to see why Marx would think that. Think of the time and place where he has been living. He's living in Western Europe, moving from one place to another, because he's often hunted by the agents of the state who view him quite properly as a subversive. And he spends a great deal of his time in England, quite a bit of time in London, and England is the country that has developed the Industrial Revolution to the greatest extent. Like Charles Dickens, and of course there are many similarities between the critique of capitalism offered in Dickens, something like Hard Times, and Marx. The moral impulse in both Dickens and Marx is the same, but what Marx wants to say is that the answer here is a return to nature, that we can get beyond that. He sees, unlike Adam Smith, primarily the downside of the Industrial Revolution. And he's right about that. I mean, let's not pull any punches about the social conditions characteristic of the working class in the middle of the 19th century in England. They were honestly wretched. If any of you get a chance to read something like Engels' piece from 1844, I think it is, The Condition of the Working Class in Manchester, you'll realize that there is a legitimate and very serious problem here, and you have to be really morally obtuse to be unable to see that fact. Marx is full of moral passion about that. And it's quite understandable. Starving children, an enormous increase in productivity, and at the same time, a general impoverishment of a large percentage of the population. People for the first time moved off the land in a relatively secure, almost organic connection to the seasons and nature, forced into urban areas. Urban slums grow up. Problems with sanitation emerge. All the problems of urban industrial life are there in full force, but there is no governmental agency like, for example, the welfare state to take care of the problems generated by capitalism. Marx, in fact, thinks that the nature of the system, the ruthlessly exploitive rationalization of society, that's a concomitant of capitalism, prevents the amelioration of the conditions of the working class, except by a global proletarian revolution. Workers of the world unite. What that means is that all across the world, Marx has one architectonic system which allows him to offer a program of political reform at a fundamental level to every society. This has is a large part of the appeal that Marxism had in the late 19th and for a good part of the 20th century on a global level. He speaks to real, both moral and political problems, and he offers a solution to people that despair of ever finding a solution. And it's entirely understandable how they might think that. One of the real tragedies in human life, one of the real horrors about the condition we find ourselves in perhaps now, is that in order to develop the comfort, the wealth, perhaps even the luxury that's characteristic of contemporary American society, contemporary industrial society, also in Western Europe, is that it is necessary to sacrifice 2 or 3 or 4 entire generations of human beings. In other words, there is a necessary element of exploitation in the development of capitalistic social relations. And this exploitation cannot be avoided. We may be able to ameliorate it by creating things like minimum wage laws, by creating health and safety regulations, but it can't be eliminated because what Adam Smith calls profit is what Marx calls surplus value. And it's built right into the system. So Marx thinks that this is not susceptible to gradual reform. It would be nice perhaps if it was, but the chances are that the ideology of the bourgeoisie, which is the people that Adam Smith calls the employers or the factory owners, makes them blind to the true condition of human beings. As a result, they have an ideological distortion, they are alienated, so they are unable to grasp the true human condition, they are unable to grasp the real trend of history, so the chances of actually explaining to these people, rationally, Marx thinks, what they ought to do to change society, to make it truly human, are nil. He certainly underestimated the capacity of capitalism to alter its conditions, to meet at least the most pressing and immediate problems. Capitalism as a system, I would say, adopted a system of what we might call Burkean piecemeal reforms, first limiting things like child labor, then limiting things like the labor of women, then limiting things like health and safety conditions, then putting together things like minimum wage laws. All things like this are attempts to kind of round off the sharp edges of a system which has, at bottom, an exploitive element to it. There's no getting around that fact. So what Marx is trying to do is explain what he thinks the future process of human history will be. Instead of a reconciliation of God with man, we are going to have a reconciliation of one segment of humanity with itself. We are going to have a reconciliation of the producers and the exploiters. It may unfortunately be necessary to kill all the exploiters, but the process of history is often rather grim and gruesome. You can't sugarcoat that element of it. But when you consider the fact that Marx, like Hegel, is projecting this trajectory on to an infinite amount of temporality, well, then the sacrifice in this generation, at this time, of an exploitive class that really has this terrible comeuppance coming to it, may be justified given the enormous benefits this will create for all of humanity throughout all the rest of human history. This sort of thinking, in some ways it is attractive, is also extremely dangerous because it gives people a license to sacrifice this generation to the next. It can easily lead to things like Stalinist abuses. As a matter of fact, it did. So the danger here is that we don't sufficiently appreciate what economists call the time discount, that we don't appreciate whatever wisdom Burke has to offer us. Instead of hoping that there'll be some pie-in-the-sky improvement that'll be permanent and wonderful and fundamentally alter human life, maybe the gradual approach to the alteration of human society is in fact the wise one, because the potential for abuse in a revolutionary situation has many of the qualities that Burke talked about. So there is a certain wisdom to that. Marx can be thought of, and I know this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it can be thought of in some respect as the last great Christian heresy, in the sense that it internalizes the value judgments of Christianity, equality, kindness to one's neighbor, concern about the feelings of other people and about the livelihoods of other people, with the scientific elements of the 19th century, particularly with English political economy and with the tradition of German idealism. So although it's kind of facetious because Marx is such a rigorously atheistic thinker, Marx of course thinks that ideas like God are alienation, are ideology, are the product of a group of people that are trying to legitimize unjust social relations. When we get to the global proletarian revolution, to the secular apocalypse, we will be able to dispense with religious formulations of our conception of the world. But Marx understands himself as the harbinger, as the sort of messenger of a new change in the world, which will allow us to reconcile not man and God, but man and man. Not only will it do that, but in the process of eliminating exploitive social relations, connecting all of human society to one common endeavor. In addition to that, it will, for the first time, free us from our heteronymous conceptions of society, free us from the illusions created by our own self-interest, free us from making exceptions to our general moral understanding of society that apply only to us and to the class we represent. Marx thinks, in other words, that his philosophy is the system by which we can discern the truly liberating human self-understanding. This is a borrowing from Hegel. Marx is essentially talking about the gradual development of human self-understanding, of human self-consciousness. But the key group, the key sociological stratum in comprehending the process of human development is not the thinkers, but the doers. And the reason why, again, this is a contribution or a borrowing or an outright theft from the English philosophical tradition. It's pragmatic, it's practical. Does it work in everyday human practice? Marx says that practice is the ultimate standard by which we judge any theory. And that's clearly not the kind of thing that he borrowed from the German intellectual tradition. That's very much an English borrowing. Now, what are the problems with this? There are lots of them. In the first case, it's not entirely true that ending capitalist social relations creates a unified classless society. In practice, as a consequence of most of the Marxist revolutions of the 20th century, we've changed the domination of one class for another. Instead of having the capitalists run things, generally speaking, intellectuals do. Very few members of Marxist ruling elites lack college degrees. Very few of them are, in fact, common, average, everyday manual laborers. They're almost exclusively not proletarians, but thinkers. In addition to that, the idea of a time discount, the apocalyptic millennial element in Marx, is extremely dangerous because it gives us license to devalue the here and now because we are playing for ultimately important stakes. The entire future of humanity rests upon the appropriately ruthless prosecution of our political platform right here and now. It is very easy to see how this can slide over into the legitimation of totalitarian political practice. In fact, that is what it has done in many cases. Think of Tiananmen Square. In addition to that, this is implicitly teleological. For all of Marx's naturalism, for all his disdain of metaphysical formulations, he really does think that history has a telos. It has a purpose, it has an end, and he has discerned that. In my estimation, this is a mythology. It is a moving mythology. It is a very intriguing mythology. But what it is a holdover from the Christian intellectual tradition, from the idea that God has a providence, but it's given a physicalistic twist, which makes it more or less consistent with the tradition of modern natural science. Marx, in other words, is attempting to square the circle. He is attempting to unify a metaphysical intellectual tradition with an essentially physical intellectual tradition, with a transcendental and a mundane intellectual tradition. And the problem is, I think, ultimately, that the tensions pull the system apart. It helps explain why there are so many diverse interpretations of Marxism. One of the reasons is that the ambiguity of Marx's thought allows both people whose basic orientation is naturalistic and people whose basic orientation is transcendental or metaphysical to both read Marx and think that they're understanding it as Marx really meant it. The real reason is because there are tensions, simple contradictions in Marx's thought which never get resolved, and the reason is that I think ultimately they can't be resolved. Ultimately, you're going to have to choose either or. You're going to be a naturalist or you're going to be a metaphysician. It is very hard to be both. If you want the naturalism, you can keep the laws of history, the Marxian iron laws of progress that Professor Staloff talked about in the last lecture. That's the naturalistic element in Marx. If you want to believe that history has a progressive tendency, if you want to believe that history is the gradual realization of human liberation, if you want to believe that there is an endpoint to the process of human development, you can't do that without metaphysics. It's implicitly Hegelian. And you can't jibe that idea unless you essentially believe that there is a plan either intrinsic to nature or in the mind of God or intrinsic to human nature or intrinsic somewhere that can be discerned that has some very queer ontological differences from a natural entity. I think, in other words, we have the ghost of metaphysics rattling its chains back there somewhere. That's why, for example, it's possible to create in this century things like liberation theology, a combination of Christianity and Marxism. If you adopt the naturalistic reading of Marx, nothing could be more implausible than liberation theology. It's totally incoherent. On the other hand, if you adopt the quasi-Hegelian, idealist, metaphysical reading of Marx, what could make more sense? We're really getting in touch with the Geist. We're really moving on to the point where everyone will be nice to each other. We're going back to the Garden of Eden. We are redeeming ourselves. History becomes the story of salvation. And I've heard this before. It's in the Bible. All right, so liberation theology, as well as alternatives to that sort of formulation of Marxism, the positivistic formulation of Marxism, characteristic of some Marxist interpreters like Plekhanov, or recently G.A. Cohen wrote a book which has a very positivistic slant on Marxism. All of these takes on Marxism manage to do what they do by doing their best to shelve or to send away the metaphysical stuff, by reducing the talk about freedom and alienation to the early Marx. The really interesting Marx for these guys is the Marx that wrote Capital in the Grundrisse, the hard, linear, deterministic Marx. The tensions between freedom and necessity, between determination and autonomy, never really get resolved in Marx. And the reason is that he touches upon the Kantian antinomies of pure reason, and he wants to have it both ways. That's what makes it moving, that's what makes it possible, that's what makes it popular, and that's also what makes it incoherent. When you get down to bedrock, he wants to do contradictory things. That's both the strong and the weak point. It appeals to a lot of people, makes it accessible and practical as a revolutionary theory. The difficulty with it is that when you work out the implications of it, you can't make it all jive. You can have this part, you can have that part, but you can't make both parts work. You can think of the metaphysical and the naturalistic elements in Marx as being essentially something analogous to an algebraic simultaneous equation. I can solve for one of these variables, I can solve for the other variable, but you can't solve for both variables at the same time. And Marx kind of papered over these problems, made gestures at saying that someday we'll solve these problems, or I kind of have solved these two variables, and here's where it comes in, but he never completely satisfactorily does that. The reason why is I think it's impossible. Now, I think it would be not entirely fair to finish with an elimination or a criticism of Marx, an elimination of Marxian philosophy. In practice, Marx has taken a thorough enough beating in the last 10 or 12 years or so it's kind of superfluous. I would say that Marx is one of the great social theorists of the 19th century, first of all, and that's to be said in his favor, because the 19th century was a great time for social theory. In addition to being one of the great social theorists of the 19th century, he is, almost by indirection, the source of many of the progressive and I think morally praiseworthy changes in contemporary advanced capitalist society. Unless there existed critics on the left who saw and who were morally sensitive to the problems generated by the division of labor, it seems to me that we would have had something like this strictly classical treatment of capitalism, and many people would have suffered needless and horrific hardships as a consequence. In other words, the development of the welfare state is homage to Marx. And I think that no sensible person wants to get rid of it. Certainly no presidential candidate wants to get rid of Social Security. And this is a way of saying that Marx was at least partially right. If he exceeded his evidence, if he is occasionally incoherent, take that with a grain of salt. He has added to the vocabulary of our political discourse and the shape, the actual form in which we put together problems of public policy. And that's the kind of contribution that will not die with the particular totalitarian political systems that have been connected with it. And that's the advantage to knowing something about Marx. You get to understand the origins of contemporary public policy and discussions about public affairs.